all of you. And Baruch Hashem, good to see you, brother. It's a really, really great day to be here today. Like I said, we're going to be today talking a lot about the different things that we see with the Yovel, the Shemitah, because these are the themes for this parasha, right? The Yovel, the Shemitah, which is the 7-year release, the Yovel, which is 50th year, and then we have the redemption of the land as well, right? Oh, and something in between that's very important. How do we treat one another? In the midst, somewhere in there. I read it somewhere in the good book. I know it's there. As we read through it, I'm going to bring it up. Somewhere it says in there that we should not aggrievate one another during this time. Why? Because it's so easy. And you're going to see really how this all plays out. But before I actually get started, I want to ask a question. What is the Hebrew word for happiness? Anybody know here? Happiness? Simcha. 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 Exactly. So why am I asking this question? Why am I asking what is the Hebrew word for simcha? Because this parasha is called what? Behar, which literally means what? At the mountain. So Kodesh Baruch Hu wants us to point us to somewhere, a direction, a point of reference. And it really goes back to Behar, in the mountain. Or we can even translate this at the mountain as well. This is what happened in the mountain. I mean, we got to really understand this, because did they go to the mountain camp? No. Why did they go to the mountain? From Egypt, they went to the mountain. To what? To receive the Torah. The beautiful words of the Torah, which is the what? By extension, the first what? 5 books of Rabbeinu Mosheh, right? That he gave to us through the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? So, how is the 5 books of Moses, right, given in Behar, in the mountain, connect us to simcha, happiness? Think about that for just a second. What is the word for simcha? If you take the word simcha in Hebrew, sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint to really show it to you here, but if you take the word for simcha and you rearrange it, you get chamisha. What is chamisha in Hebrew? 5. Correlating to the 5 books of Moshe, which is where we receive simcha. You see this? This is really, really beautiful. What's the point? The point that we're getting at is that first and foremost, the Torah does not restrict us. You know, how many of us see the Torah as a restriction? Anybody? Like, dudes don't, I saw you drinking coffee and you know what? You inspire me. It's good to be inspired. Baruch Hashem. Going back to, do you feel that the Torah restricts you? And the answer for that should be yes. It's okay to say yes. You don't have to play, Mr. or Mrs. Pius here today. But in reality, in the words of Rabbi Benjamin Blech, he says that the Torah, in its essence, does not restrict us, but rather, what does the Torah do for us? It enables us to be free, in an essence. Why? Because it gives us the freedom to live up to our potential and to become the greatest, in essence. Imagine if you live in a world where you have no potential to becoming great. Some people live that reality today. Their reality is that they will only become as great as maybe their dad, maybe their uncle, but that's it. There's a cast, there's a limit as to how high they can go. The Torah breaks those barriers for each and one of us, which is a really, really beautiful thing. Free to become more like God. After all, according to Genesis, says that Hashem created us in His what? In His image. So if Hashem created us in His image, it's so that we can project that every single day of our lives. Right? But it seems like an impossible task. Like, how can we be like HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Well, we're not saying that we're divine by no means. But we can display the attributes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Intelligence, greatness, creation, all of it. This is why mankind, imagine if God would have just created man and put him on the earth, we still be living in caves, right? There's some tree or some rock. But look how much mankind has evolved, because this is the way it was designed in reality. So we read in this portion about what? The Shemitah, the Yovel, and the redemption of the land, right? Which all corresponds to what? If you really, really pay attention, all corresponds to the 7-day cycle of creation. The Shabbos, right? So I want to take us real quickly to see some things in here that I thought were very, very interesting. I want to share with you, if you don't mind. Do we have time to share? Baruch Hashem. Just to make sure that you're okay with it. It says, Hashem spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say unto them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall observe a Sabbath, it says, rest for Hashem. The very, very opening of Behar in the mountain, it says, Vayidaber Hashem el Mosheh Bahar Sinai le'emor, daber el bnei Israel ve'amarta la'eleihem, ki davoa el ha'eretz asher ani noten lachem, ve'shafta ha'eretz Shabbat le'Adonai. The land is to be given a rest to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but why is the land getting a rest? What's the purpose of the rest? Now, please keep this in mind. I want you to understand that if the land needs a 7-day cycle rest, how much more the people who inhabit the earth? Are you understanding this? Because, you see, everything has to be symmetrical. You can't be like this. It has to have symmetry. It has to flow. It has to blend, essentially. Everything in creation needs to correspond to one another in this beautiful blend, and it all tracks back to the Creator, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? And when was this actually given? What was the purpose of this? The importance of having the Shabbat, folks, and how it connects us to the Shemitah, to the Yovel, and to also the ultimate redemption of the land, which by extension, what we're talking about in here is the coming of Mashiach. How many of us want Mashiach? It corresponds to the redemption of the land. There's no redemption of the land without Mashiach, and vice versa. It's like a marriage together. It works together. So he said that he is given this observance of the Shabbat for the land, even the land in itself. Now, I got to share this with you because you're going to think to yourself, well, what's the big deal, right? It's just a Sabbath rest to the land. Like, what's so great about it? What's so great about it, and I want to open up in here with the actual Chumash. Chumash shares something very, very beautiful about this. It says, at first glance, the opening content of the parasha seems almost antithetical to the people's exalted spiritual state at Mount Sinai. Why? Because they received the Torah, right? Don't do this, don't do that, do this, do that. You get the drift. Everything in the Torah corresponding specifically when we're looking at the first 10 words, corresponding to the relationship between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the relationship between one another. And that makes perfect sense. It does. Like, what universe do you live in if this doesn't make sense? Now, we're going to get into the areas where it doesn't make sense. See, this is where it gets very, 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 very interesting. Because, you see, we can materialize the spiritual matters that corresponds to the moral duty of each and one of us. But how do we materialize the things of the world that necessarily have nothing to do with morality? For instance, we're going to talk today about the 7-year rest of the land. In the logic of any human being, that makes no sense. How can you give the land, and by the way, I'm going to expound just slightly today for the sake of time, and what that really looked like, so that you can understand why Bnei Israel actually never kept a Jubilee, by the way, except for the time of Hezekiah. That they actually, for the first time in history, they actually kept Jubilee. But other than that, they never did. Right? And one must ask, if Bnei Israel received the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right, directly from God? Wrong, they didn't. They only received the first 2 words. That's why Rabbeinu Moshe only gave him 611 commandments. The extra 2 actually came from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what was the first 2? I am the Lord your God, and you shall not have no other gods before me. At that point, Bnei Israel says, we're done. We cannot take the voice of God. Moshe, you go up and you talk to God. So this is the reason why the 613, really 2 are attributed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the 611 attributed to Rabbeinu Moshe. But what they heard was, I am the Lord your God, who redeemed you from the land of Egypt, and you shall have no other gods before me. Which entails Avodah Zarah in general, right? But now we get into areas that are, again, we're gonna see really how this kind of plays out. Like, wow, we're getting into areas that deal with our everyday life. You know, when you think of a religion, what do you think? Something that's part-time. I call it part-time. It's kind of like, the reserves. 1 week in a month type thing. But that's what religion is. Religion in general is, you go to your establishment and then once a week, on that day you become very religious, and then you go back to the mundane and you become very mundane. Right? Achati, from brother to brother. We can speak in here with truthfulness, right? And I'm not condemnatory. I'm the first one to tell you, I'm guilty for this. But what the Torah does is it challenges us because it wants our attention even on the day outside of the Shabbos. On the other 6 days of the week, the Torah is more concerned on what you do and what you don't do as opposed to what you do on the Shabbat. If that makes any sense. See, it's the other way around. So, now, with this said, continuing here with the Chumash, says, let us recall that Mount Sinai was the scene of what was the most intense divine revelation ever experienced in history when the Torah was given. Here, as well as the bulk of the Torah's laws were explained in detail, as God communicated with Moses over a period almost a full year, it says. At the foot of the mountain, the tabernacle was first set up, in which God revealed his presence to his people in the heavenly fire that consumed the daily sacrifices. In short, it was this exalted mountain that our people attained the most sublime spiritual heights, thereby being freed from the confines of the mundane existence. However, in contrast, the commandments and human concerns that open with Parashah, Behar, are quite mundane, they say. The injunction to refrain from working the land in the 7th year entail grappling with very practical material matters. The Torah itself acknowledged that as it addresses the skeptical question that we're going to read about here today, and that question is, if you shall wonder, what will we eat on the 7th year? What an appropriate question to ask and to be inserted in this parasha. How many of us ask that same question here today, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if I'm actually obedient to your word, what, and you fill in the blanks? Like for instance, Shabbat, I can go to work and make so much money. This is the day that I really can bank it. But Hashem says, if you take this day off, here's what's going to proceed. Right? This is now taking and transforming the spiritual and bring it into the material. You realize that this is our job. Our job is to bring the spiritual concept into what? Into the material world that we live in today. Otherwise, how will people know who God is? For instance, if God says that you are to take the Sabbath off, right? Or in this case, the Shemitah every 7 years for the land, the rest, right? Or the Yovel, we go even higher. There's got to be an essence of emunah and faith, and there's got to be an essence where the people can see that say, you know what this person is saying is actually true. Otherwise, it's void. Otherwise, it's just literature. Does that make any sense? In other words, how can you logically explain the Sabbath, the Shemitah, and the Jubilee to the average person in the world? One may say, well, all you need is a day off. That can be Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Why Shabbat? Is it about taking the one day off during the week? The question is. Or is it specifically about the Shabbos and the Shemitah and the Jovel that Hashem says, I will now command my blessing to you? And if so, what's so relevant about the 7th day? Why can we not do the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th? Like I said, if it's a matter of just a day off, we can take a day off any day during the week. So let's bring this to the crops. Let's bring this concept to the crops now. Because one may argue, well, we can rotate the crops, right? Give the crops rest. So like that, we're not toiling the land all the time. Because logically, that makes sense. We're depleting the land. But if we can give the land rest, it doesn't matter whether it's the 7th day or not. Or does it? So, hold on to that thought right there. Continuing on in here. It says from there, the subject matter gets progressively further from spiritual heights we associate with Mount Sinai. We are told that should we not refrain from agriculture pursuits during the 7th year, we will eventually be forced to sell our assets. If we don't do this, we're talking about Shemitah now. Then our inheritance, then our home, then to borrow an interest. If we do not stop this downward spiral of spiritual descent, we will ultimately have to sell ourselves as slaves to a fellow Jew, then even worse to a Gentile, and then even worse to an attendant in the service of idolatry. You go into the spiritual decline. Now, one may ask, well, how do we know this is true? Well, read the history. If there's ever a proof that this is true, is the fact that they didn't do it. It's the opposite. The fact that they didn't do it and we saw the results of that, it's a proof in itself, meaning that the opposite is true. In other words, if you're telling me if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen, and actually happens, that means that if I do it, there's truth to that. It's elemental truth to that. Am I losing you? Good. So, this is where now it takes the twist. Thus, Parashat Behar opens with an allusion to the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai in order to remind us that it is from the Torah and only from the Torah that we possess the power to elevate even the most mundane aspects of life into spiritual realm. And that is the purpose completely of Bnei Israel, in essence and in a nutshell. So now, going back to this parasha, the reading. In verse 18, it opens up by saying, you shall perform my decrees and observe my ordinances and perform them, then you will dwell securely in the land. Right? And it says in Hebrew, ve'asitem et chukotai ve'et mimishpotai tishmeru ve'asitem otam ve'yishaftem al ha'eretz labetach. It's very interesting how this actually portion opens. Or because it says you shall perform my degrees, and do all these different things, right? And I will let you dwell in the land, what? Safely. Betach. Do you know that betach in Hebrew is a common word that you use in Israel? And you're talking to somebody and it's something like, what the person is saying is absolute true. You say, yeah, betach. Like, sure, of course. That's the word. But this word in biblical Hebrew literally meant like securely, peacefully, but it carries also an understanding in modern Hebrew as, guess what? Beta also means insurance. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving us an insurance policy for peace if we were to do these things, he says. Like when we think of insurance, nowadays doesn't give a good connotation because insurance usually scam you, right? Quote unquote. Not always true. But it's good to have insurance. Everybody wants insurance. By the way, why are you married? Insurance. I want to make sure that you're not going to take off of me overnight, right? It's like you got to have some kind of insurance policy. Why do you have insurance in your car? Why do you have insurance in your house? All these different things. Because we want security. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says in here, in this very opening, that if you keep the mishpatai, you to keep the decree, he said that you will dwell securely. And it is and he's going to give us that insurance policy essentially, that it will be essentially very, very good for us. And that's why it's so important to understand. The Shemitah and the Jovel and the weekly Sabbath are insurance policies, essentially. For what? What is the insurance policy for? For living securely and peacefully. How many of us want to live securely and peacefully? Am I going too fast for you? Got material to cover here. So, the Shemitah and the Jovel and the weekly Shabbos gives us that insurance policy that Hashem will not forsake us and that yes, we will actually dwell securely. Now, taking the twist, not going into the whole Shemitah and Jovel. Continues on verse 19, says, the land will give its fruit and you will eat your fill. You will dwell securely upon it. If you will say, what will we eat in the 7th year? Behold, we will not sow and not gather in our crops. Stop. A very legitimate question. Now the Torah is shifting in here, showing that the audience that God is dealing with are actually humans. There's concerns. Like they're saying, what are we going to eat? If you don't want us to toil, and by the way, I'm going to share with you in here what that really entails. It's kind of very, very, very interesting. Let me read this in here. It says, speak to the Israelites. You must say to them, as I have told you, when you enter the land I am giving you, the land must periodically rest by observing an agricultural Sabbath in honor of God and in acknowledgement of the fact that he created the world. Why the 7th day is so specific, the day that Hashem says that we are to give honor to him, is for the commemoration of creation. Has nothing to do with taking a day off, because you can take a day off any day of the week. This is to honor Hashem, by the way. It's to honor Hashem. And how many of us want to honor Hashem? This is one way to honor Hashem. There's many ways, but this is one that he says, every week you can honor me, and you can remind the whole world out there there is a God that created everything by taking this day off, right? But then it says, once you are conquered and set on the land, you must begin counting the years, it says. You may sow your fields for 6 years, right? You may prune your vineyards for 6 years, gathering the land's produce. But the 7th year, the land must be given a complete rest. This is a Sabbath in honor of God. You must not sow your field. You may not prune your vineyard. It says in here, and this is what's interesting, during this year, you may only gather produce that has been declared ownerless. This is the key. Check this out. It's going to blow your mind. You can only eat from the land that has been declared ownerless. Why? Because on the Sabbath, all the land reverts back to who? To the owner. Who's the owner? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Who created the earth? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Who created the vineyard? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So everything goes back to him. So, let me explain more. If you do not declare the produce of your field, now this is going to blow your mind completely. You want to talk about the essence of emunah? Now you're going to understand why these people never, ever, ever kept it for the most part. As human beings, now we can understand this. Look what it states in here. During this year, you may only gather the produce that is ownerless. If you do not declare the produce of your fields and vineyards ownerless, you may not even reap the aftergrowth. Whatever has grown on its own from the seed that fell to the ground during the previous harvest. You may not pick the grapes that you have set aside for yourself, for this must be a year of rest for the land with respect to ownership too. So, let's just say that you have 10 acres, 20 acres. All of you are here homesteaders. So if you lived in Israel in biblical times, during the Shemitah, you had to declare to the Sanhedrin that your land is ownerless now. Now you can partake in the 7th year of the growth that comes out of the land. Make sense? It's interesting. But it gets better. The twist gets better. So it says in here, once you have declared the produce that grows during the Sabbath of the land ownerless, it will be yours to eat. It must be equally available for you, for your Jewish bondsmen, for the bondmen, as well as for the non-Jewish hired worker, as well as the resident alien who lives with you. All of its produce must also be made freely available to eat for your domestic animals and for the undomesticated animals that are in your land on equal basis as well. Isn't that interesting? So let me put it in real time. So you work this land, you purchase the land, you toil the land, and in the 7th year you have to declare the land ownerless. And now everybody can come and partake, including yourself, partake of the growth of the land on the 7th year. That makes sense? Of course it doesn't make sense in any language, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, yes, if you were to do this, this is what's going to happen. What's going to happen? This is the challenge, because now we're dealing with material possession. We're dealing with the aspects of everyday life. And what we're doing is we are spiritualizing the material things of life to be able to what? To believe that God exists and that his words are proven true. This is the key. So, then it says, if you do this, which I just read about, again, giving the land ownerless, and you'll be able to partake of this, he says, in 21, he says this, which is very, very interesting. In verse 21, it says, I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, and it will yield a crop sufficient for a 3-year period. It says in here, Vechi tomru, ma nochal bashana v'shivi'it. That's the question. What will we eat, right? What is it that we're going to eat on the 7th year? It says, lo nizra ve'lo ne'esef, et tevuotnu. Then he says, vetziviti et brichati lachem bashana. In the translation it says, if you do this and you keep it, right, I will ordain my blessing. In Hebrew, it doesn't say ordain. In Hebrew, it literally says, vetziviti et brichati. I will command. It's from the word mitzvah. Hashem says that he himself is going to give the mitzvah of his what? Of his blessing. Now, this is what's going to be very striking about this. Because what is the Hebrew word for blessing? Bracha, right? If you look at the gematria for bracha, it gives us a total of 227. 227, which is bracha, brings us to the Hebrew word zachor in Hebrew. Zachor is 227, which what is zachor? We're remembering. In other words, he says, I will command the blessing when this was given, and this blessing is to be a zachor, a remembrance for all generations to come. This is what's so beautiful. In other words, we have detailed proof of this from the Holy Torah, from the Tanakh, from the Bnei Israel, from the people of Israel. And what's the point of the zachor is the blessings are to be what? Recalled at all times also. See? And that's the point as we going into the portion of this. It says, I will ordain my blessing, he says, for you. In the 6th year, it will yield crop sufficient for a 3-year period. So notice what's getting blessed. What's getting blessed? Think about this, folks. This is what's so beautiful. The 7 years not being blessed. He didn't say, I will ordain my blessing for you on the 7th year. He says, I will command my blessing for you on the 6th year. Why the 6th? The 7 is the one that we rest. Because the idea, according to the Maharal, says that the idea with this is that in faith, we actually, because we are toiling on the 6th day, that work in itself, he blesses it. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want us to sit around and wait for blessings to come, but rather the blessings need to be worked. That's why he says, I will put my blessing on the 6th year. In the 6th year, you're working. That work that you're doing in faith, because you're already planning to take the 7th year off for Shemitah, He said, because you are planning to take this 7-year off, everything that you put your hands on the 6th year, I will multiply it that will last you for 3 years. Wow. Isn't that amazing? Now, on the contrary, you could have another person that says, well, I don't believe that. I am going to work on the 6th year, but I'm also going to work on the 7th year. And they may get results, but it'll be of the fruit of their hands, and ultimately it will lead to nothing. Where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, if you actually trust in me, trust is not something that trust is an action. So we are working on the 6th year. We're working towards this because we believe that if we work on the 6th year and we take the Shemitah off, the land will produce it. By the way, in the time of Hezekiah, this actually became a reality, believe it or not. That's why Hezekiah was known as, the Tanakh says that there will never be another king like King Hezekiah. Or not that there will never be, there never was a king like King Hezekiah. Why? Because Hezekiah actually tested this, implemented this, and it actually worked. It's funny, though, how quickly people can veer off, even when there's tangible evidence. I mean, you would think that this is an entire nation. No, unfortunately, it didn't work that way. So, he says that I will what? Bitziti et brechati lachem b'shana hashishit, right? Ve'asa et hatevuah, which is the produce, lishlosh hashanim. It will last you for a 3-year period. You imagine how beautiful that could have been and how beautiful it was? And I want to share this in here when he commands specifically. Because this is, when he says, I will command my blessing, the Chumash has an amazing drash on this. And this is an encouragement for each and one of us, folks. Truly an encouragement for each and one of us to know that it doesn't matter. Because in here, folks, here's the thing. Hashem commanded this to a nation. Right? Now, if you were God, I want you to think for me for just a second. Let's just think outside of the box. If you're God right now, right? And you wanted to project and you wanted the people to know about this, right? Got 8 billion souls in the world or so. How will you do this without tampering with free will and all the other things that God actually is restricted with, believe it or not? How will you do this? First of all, you can't obligate people, right? Because that kind of goes against free will. I can't tell you you need to do this. However, if you vow to me that you want to be a priesthood of mine, now I can obligate you to do something. Why? Because you vowing that you want to be a priest of mine. I can't do that if somebody who's not going to be a priest of mine. But if you're going to be my priest, and always you're going to come work for me directly, then I can put these stipulations that you have to do these things. Why? Because the idea is that Kol Israel is supposed to be a model for the whole entire world to know and see. In other words, the Torah is commanded, but the Torah is also what? Chokhmah in Hebrew, wisdom. So while the priesthood nation is obligated to do this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to the rest of the nations, do this and test me and you'll see the result. The results are still the same, by the way. This results works for the priesthood and the non-priesthood. Doesn't matter. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, if you do this, if you trust in me, and you actually do this, this is the results that you can see and you will have. And you don't have to be the priesthood nation, but you still have to take it in faith. In other words, you don't have to, but how much beautiful it is when you do. Right? How much better is when I don't have to put a gun to your head for you to do something. You just do it because you what? You genuinely believe. Right? So, I want to read this from the Chumash. It says, when I will command my blessing, right, which is, again, command, and the Chabad in here did a really good job with this. It says, it is tempting to suppose that the sabbatical year is nothing more than a means of naturally improving the fertility of the soil. Okay? We could then think that with modern agronomic advances such as crop rotation and fertilization, etc., there's no need to let the land lie fallow for a year. Kind of like what I was elaborating earlier. So the observance of the sabbatical year is no longer relevant then, if we have modern technology. It is in order to disprove this argument that God promises his blessing specifically for the 6th year, where the purpose of the commandment to allow the soil to be replenished, God would have promised to increase the yield of the year following the follow year, not the year preceding it. By promising an increased yield in the 6th year, which should naturally be least productive, God shows us that it is specifically and exclusively his blessing that is the source of the increase of the yield. Although the laws of the sabbatical year apply only in the land of Israel, by the way, it is a lesson. The rabbis go on to say in here, it is a lesson, its lessons are applicable wherever we live, essentially. It says in here, as Jews, we are required to spend time every day praying and studying the Torah. We must give charity, support Jewish education, abstain from work on Shabbat and Jewish holidays. How can we hope to live financially sound lives when we see our non-Jewish neighbors who are not handicapped, quote unquote, by any of these obligations and restrictions, struggling to earn their livelihood? The sabbatical year teaches us that when we do what God desires, he will bless us, not only spiritually, but materially as well. When God hid his presence, and they go on to saying about when he says that he will command my blessing. When God hid his presence after Adam ate and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, he limited this concealment to 6,000 years. How do we know this? Because in Sefer Bereshit it says that man shall live to 120. Well, we know very well that man lived way above 120 after that. The Torah doesn't lie. Our rabbi says that the 120 corresponds to 120 jubilees. Mankind will have 120 jubilees. What is 120 times 50? 6,000. 6,000 years. This is where they get it from. So, it says in here that the concealment, why they say the concealment? Because it is understood that Hashem right now hides behind creation, which is why we don't see all the miracles like they did before. So this concealment will last for 6,000 years. Although we can usher it earlier, the Messianic era will commence no later than the beginning of the 7th millennium, essentially. Allegorically, the 6 years during which agricultural work is permitted correspond to the 6th millennium, to this present state of existence that we live right now. That's a beautiful connection that they make in here. The 6 days of work corresponding to the 6,000 years of creation. The sabbatical year corresponds to the 7th millennium, when the world will rest from its present state. We are now in the latter part of the 6th millennium, they say. The latter part of it, folks, nearing the end of the 6th year. This is why it's so hard, if you really notice right now, so difficult. But this is why we have to push through the klippah. In this context, the same question posed in the preceding verse applies. We know that the divine consciousness and spiritual strength of our generation cannot compare to those of the earlier ones. We may therefore wonder how it can be that the 6th year, the weakest one, and what they're talking about is in this millennium, this 6,000 year millennium, it's spiritually deprived completely. Well, just kind of look around what's happening. There's just no morality anymore. So it is the hardest, essentially, corresponding to the 6th day of work, where the 6th day was always the hardest. Think about this in terms of work, right? What happens on Friday? We're tired, man. As a matter of fact, in the workforce, Fridays is like a day more lax, sort of to speak. Because we've been working all week. Friday, we just want to get out of there, right? It's funny how concepts from the Torah actually bleed into the real world. So, what they say in here, because this is the most difficult one, is the one that if we put all our attention to and we work hard, he will bless it for 3 years. This is just beautiful. It says in here, the weakest one, which is the 6th day, will be the one to provide for the 7. How can our relatively weak spirituality usher in the redemption when the superior spirituality of our holy ancestors did not? In other words, and I think we can all agree with this, people were more spiritual back then than they are today. Today it's more materialized with technology and everything, you know. Back then people were just more spiritual, you know. So what they're saying is, how is it that today in our era we can usher the redemption, but our ancestors who live in an era that was so more spiritual, if I may say so, they were not able to do this? To reply to this, God replies that in the merit of our simple faith, expressed in our dedication to our divine mission despite all obstacles, and beyond the constraints of logic, that's a big one, he will increase the yield of the 6th year and bring us to the final redemption of the world. That's beautiful words that I want to end with today, because this is the whole aspect of it. Folks, things that look in the natural and the superficial in where we live right now can be very deceiving. We need to be very, very careful with this. We need to continue to trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu for all our provision. And that doesn't mean that we sit around and do nothing. It just means that our action and our belief will carry us to the next level, folks. And in doing that, he will bless the fruit of our hands. You know, I cannot express this and how important it is, how it's affected my life at so many different levels, folks. And I see it in other people's lives as well, Jews and non-Jews, regardless. When we take the Sabbath seriously, because this corresponds to the Sabbath, as the Shemitah and the Yovel all correspond to the 7th day. We are acknowledging to the people in the world again that there's a God in Israel and he is alive. Not only that, folks, but we are showing the world that the world has book helps out there, wisdom, how to do this, how to do that, how to attain more wealth. And, these books are not bad, don't get me wrong. But I think that we have a gem in the Torah. There's a gem here, folks, that most people don't read. Most people don't care. That I think that we can harvest from this gem if we, especially collectively, do this. It's a beautiful thing. Because we want to bear witness to the world. We want to influence. By the way, you cannot influence people to fear God if you yourself are not doing it, if that makes any sense. I can't tell you trust God when I myself am not trusting God. I have to be a living witness for you to see. And that was the purpose of Bnei Israel. That's why the prophet Yeshayahu says that they are to be a mamlechet hakohanim. They are to be a kingdom of priests. For what purpose? So that the glory of Hashem and the beautiful words of the Torah will be spread from one end of the earth to the other. Folks, if it was just limited to Israel, the book would have ended literally in Deuteronomy. That's it. Or Joshua, because they enter the land in Joshua. They would have ended there. There would have been no more Tanakh. That's it. The Tanakh would only be reading up to Joshua, because we made the accomplishment. The Jews have the Torah, and now they're in the land, and party, let's go. We're done. But the work of this is beyond Canaan. The work of this is to go to all four corners of the earth. And how do we know this? How do we know this is true? Because the prophet also, the Nevi'im, expounded to us, our beloved rabbis from the Tanakh period also share with us that in that day, Jeremiah chapter 31, it says, on that day, no one will teach his neighbor to know God, for all will know me, from the least to the greatest of them. The prophet also expounds that on that day, all will require to come up to Jerusalem on the pilgrim feast. And those who do not come up to Jerusalem on the pilgrim feast, unfortunately, the rain will not come to you. This is the purpose, folks. You know, there was a court of the Gentiles, by the way, in the temple. I don't know if you guys are aware of that. What is a court of the Gentiles doing there? First of all, if you were a Gentile, what were you even doing there? What business do you have doing in Israel during the so great high holy festivals? Especially the pilgrim festivals. Those are very specific. Why would they be a court of the Gentiles? Nama. Because these are the Gentiles, they fear HaKodesh Baruch Hu, and they're there for a reason. Why are they there? They could be partying in Hawaii. They don't have to be there for Passover. They could be eating pork in Hawaii, by the beach, with a margarita. But they're there in the court. They're going to be there in the court, right? Celebrating the festivals of HaKodesh Baruch Hu. Why? Because the original purpose is for this to go to the entire world, folks. As the prophet also expounds that God is a God of the entire world. He's not just limited to the Eretz Israel. All Eretz Israel, where his footstool will be. But he created the whole entire universe, folks. And it is for the entire universe. So I hope that this is a message that is very, very good for you. I will really, really expound that you will really meditate on this. Don't take it lightly. Trust in God. And listen, what it all boils down to is trusting in God. And God says, if you do this, I promise you I will bless the fruit of your hands. And whatever you put your hands in, it will double. Simple as that. And I'm a living testimony for that, folks. Tell you the truth. Be'emet. It's the truth. Trust in Hashem. Don't trust in the logic of your head. Don't trust in the fruit of the might of your hands. This is why in Deuteronomy he tells them, on that day, do not say, my might and my hands made this happen. How can we declare that? Only when we live in a life of obedience to HaKodesh Baruch Hu. And in the midst of this parasha also, it teaches us that we need to love our neighbor, because in this parasha, of course, deals with, which I'm not going to go into right now, but it talks about the, what do you call that? The when you release the land, also we have property that was involved. And this was very complicated. This is not that simple as it seems. We're just doing it on a surface teaching today, but it's just more complicated than that. Now we're getting into real estate contracts in here. And you have to deduct the price for the Jovel depending on when the Jovel is and how much is left in the Jovel. You're not supposed to cheat your brother in the sale of the property. All these things, the land of redemption. I mean, it gets really, really, really complicated. But the whole purpose of that is to teach us, folks, that we need to be looking out. What is the essence of that? The essence of that really has to do with loving your neighbor as you love yourself. Why? Because do you want to be cheated? Well, then don't cheat somebody else. You want to be treated honorably. It doesn't matter, again, who you are. We treat everybody with honor, simply put. Why? Because that's how we want to be treated. It's a concept that Hillel taught in Pirkei Avot. So it's a concept that we see even in the Tanakh, is my point. So, Parasha Behar. Let us continue that with this week. In the mountain, we want to take the spiritual matters and we want to transform it into material world here. We want to infinite. By the way, this is how the Messianic redemption comes. How does the Messianic redemption comes? We have to infuse the world with what? With the spirituality, the holiness. So that it can take material, it can be real. See what I mean? Otherwise, it remains spiritual. We have to transform. That's why we have the Sulam. The Sulam connects heaven and earth. Bringing the things from heaven down into earth and so on and so forth. You see what I mean? So it's bridging those two, and that's the purpose of the Torah that he has given for his people and for his people to share with the world so that the world may glean and the world may grow. And by doing that, we usher the coming of the true Mashiach. May Hashem bless you and keep you.